My name is Matt Mowrey. I'm a Senior Director of a group at my company that we call Finance Analytics and Business Performance. What that breaks down into is that I oversee our project financial accounting, our financial planning and analysis, and then I also oversee a business intelligence team, which is growing, including myself now. It's 4 people, including the folks on our, not including the folks on our FP&A team that have some acumen in business intelligence. So just by way of, this is the content of what I'm going to be talking about today. So I'm just going to give you a brief introduction of our business, so you can kind of see where we're coming from and kind of what we're managing. Then I'm going to give you a quick history of our analytic environment, because there is pretty much a clear progression of how our analytic environment has evolved over the last 10 years. And then I'm going to start to talk more specifically about where we started with Power BI. It wasn't even called Power BI when we started with it. It was just called Power Pivot. And I'll talk a little bit about where we are today and then how we got there. And then the final piece of it is really the biggest lessons that we learned during that whole journey. Just want to say that you're welcome to ask questions as we go along. I am going to try to leave a block at the end, so if we don't use it in the middle, we'll try to. I'll have time, 15 or so minutes at the end to ask questions. So. All right, so we are. Oops. You know what? I am very sorry here. All right, we're just going to go with it. This was the pre-final version of my presentation, but we're going with it. All right. So we are a global development services consulting firm. My company basically implements foreign aid projects in developing countries. So when the State Department makes policy, that policy is then handed to the Agency for International Development to actually kind of put those words and that policy into action. So we bid on those projects, and we hopefully win them and then go implement them. We also have, in addition to our U.S. representation, we also operate in Europe. And so we work for the UK governments, the European Commission, and we have a small private sector consulting arm as well that's been pretty successful and growing over the last couple years. Our operations are in developing countries and around the world, so we encounter a lot of challenges. Most of our projects, when we win the project, it basically becomes a very standalone business really. So if you could imagine winning a project and being the team leader for one of these projects and saying, hey, you're going to go out into the middle of South Sudan and you're calling the shots, right? From everything from how the project's going to be implemented to how you use your analysis, all of that type of stuff. So we have many challenges around those areas. This year we're celebrating our 50th anniversary, which we're pretty proud of. Started in 1970. And another thing that we're pretty proud of is that we're employee owned. So everybody in the company owns a piece of it. All right. So quick history of our analytic environment. We're running Oracle ERP. So basically all of our financials, and you got to remember I come from a financial background, so most of the stuff I'm going to be talking about today is financial. I do have some non-financial stuff peppered in, but most of the data that we're trying to get out and present into ultimately Power BI nowadays is coming from Oracle ERP. So we've got that whole web of tables and things that we're trying to navigate all the time. Prior to probably about 4 or 5 years ago, we were running a Microsoft product called Performance Point. Actually, we're still running it today. We're kind of cobbling it along today. But Microsoft Performance Point is a SSAS multidimensional kind of product. It was out for just a few years before Microsoft pulled the plug on it. As a matter of fact, sometimes even with Microsoft people, I mention it to them and they have no idea what I'm talking about. What this particular product actually did for us was not only give us our financial planning and analysis, but it was also kind of a BI tool. So predates, Power BI. And just a quick word on how I disassociate BI with financial planning analysis. This is my definition. I'm not saying this is Webster's dictionary or Microsoft's dictionary, but I look at financial planning analysis being under the umbrella of BI. Okay, so when I'm talking about BI, I'm inclusive of financial planning and analysis. And when I talk about financial planning and analysis, the way that I really target the definition in my head is that if you have a data intersection that has a plan next to it, it's financial planning and analysis. If you have a data intersection that doesn't have a plan next to it, it's business intelligence. So that's the way that I keep things straight in my head. So, for example, if you're planning revenue, let's say, right, that's probably going to be included in my definition of FP&A. If you're looking at another financial measure like invoiced amounts or things like that you don't, usually plan, then that is part of BI, right? That might tell you something about your business or your volume of invoices or that type of thing, but there's not necessarily a plan next to how much you're going to invoice every month. So like I said, the models within Performance Point, they were used for FP&A and BI, which for me actually made it a very exceptional tool because we did a lot of different things with it, and were able to program a lot of intelligence into those models that gave us some great data. And we're trying to make sure that those, that everything that we figured out is still carrying over today. This system was accessed in two different ways. We accessed it with an Excel add-in. So we accessed it with Excel add-in and then SQL services, reporting services. So you had to have a SQL programmer in order to, you could create really neat reporting. Remember, you got to rewind to like 2008 here, right? You could create really neat reporting with SSRS. I mean, that was really kind of your Power BI desktop in a way. Without the usability, you had to have somebody with that specialized knowledge. Just one note about the Excel add-in is that the version of Performance Point, Performance Point as it was, full stop, was provisioned for Excel 2007. So even today, as we're transitioning to our new thing, we are keeping a version of Excel 2007 running on a laptop with a deprecated operating system running on, So I've heard horror stories about people. A friend of mine was telling me that they have some, I don't know if it's SQL 98 or some old version of SQL, and they're paying Microsoft exorbitant amounts of money to just keep their SQL operating system running. So we're trying to avoid that. All right, so where we started. So kind of the beginning. And this is where we started with Power BI. Actually, the person who showed me Power BI is in the room in the back left corner. And it wasn't called Power BI in 2012, it was called Power Pivot. And that was really the only piece of Power BI that existed at the time. So as this group may or may not know, it's embedded in Excel. Once I was shown that you could take this data model and do this in aggregate and all these different things, like I was totally taken by the whole idea of Power Pivot. Then what happened was that somebody came along and said, well, you know what you can do with these Power Pivots that you created in Excel? You can actually publish them to a SharePoint BI site. And if you go to SharePoint BI site, then you can have these maps, right? And so when I started going on a dog and pony show around my company, showing off these maps, everybody fell in love with the maps, right? It was, hey, can I put counts of this on the map, and can I put gross profit on the map, and can I make the circles bigger and smaller and change the colors? So, and I don't know if anybody's had this experience with the maps. When you would go from one map to another, it would have this like swiping thing that would like swipe to the next map and swipe to this. And so anyway, that was a big deal in 2012. So also in 2012, it started my just complete fumbling with data modeling in DAX. You know, I had a little bit of knowledge to be dangerous, and then ended up taking a couple of courses. There were only a few Power BI courses out there. So, you know, pretty much I was, you know, pulling in tables. If I could see a connection, I was drawing a line to them, and if I could basically write any sort of DAX, I was doing it, and I was starting to dig into deeper and deeper on what you could do with DAX. Power Query was nowhere, anywhere, which actually, for me, was not a bad thing, because I've had a really talented SQL developer on my team for the past 10, 11 years now. So he went to work with writing all kinds of views, rather, right? Hey, can you create a view for this? Can you create a view for that? So that was my Power Query, and actually it's kind of coming back around. I mean, there's a time and place for Power Query, but you know, I still make good use of him on the kind of the ETL side of things. And there was no governance and zero documentation about anything. We just didn't have time to do this, especially as people, you know, my boss and others that were starting to see the opportunity and the analytic capability and all this. You know, we just were kind of working at lightning speed, learning as much as we can, rolling out as much as we can. All right. So where we are today, we are definitely getting it together, and we have answers to key questions have become much clearer. So what that DAX and data modeling, you know, kind of grew into was being able to recognize a good data model, and then being able to recognize good DAX, and then being able to recognize optimized DAX, right? Because all of these things for me were kind of trial and error. I mean, I you know, have been able to completely blow up a data model or take a refresh time from like 1.5 minutes to over 20 minutes just by writing some DAX code. So learn some kind of hard lessons, and we, you know, basically took the data modeling and the DAX, and then somebody came along and introduced to me SSAS Tabular, which, if you don't know what SSAS Tabular is, it's basically the same tabular engine that you find in Excel and Power BI, but on a centralized server level, right? So as soon as you open up SSAS Tabular, you see basically a lot of the same things you would see in Power BI and in Excel. So then that, of course, opened up a huge, wide range of possibilities for us to now start distributing information. People could connect to the data, to the measures, without having the data materialize in their workbooks. You know, and having different sources of truth, right? One of the keynote speaker, I remember this keynote speaker, the other session that I was in, they were talking about, you know, having different versions of the truth. Well, Bob produced this gross profit report, and Mary produced this gross profit report. Well, how did that happen? You know, that they have two different numbers. Well, oh, they forgot to refresh, right? It's like the Jerry Seinfeld, the AM PM thing, right? You know, forgot to refresh. So once we had those, once we had kind of an enterprise level solution, then we've started to get into questions about, like, you know, how are reports developed, how are they deployed, where are they stored, how are they visualized, how do we keep documentation on the data model? So things I'm going to be talking about a little bit later. And one kind of big sigh of relief that I've taken probably in the last 12 to 18 months is a focus on knowledge transfer. I can't remember if it's Marco Russo or Alberto Ferreri that talks about in one of their speeches on how, in the 90s when they were developers, BI developers, it was all about, them owning everything, right? They owned the formula, they owned the logic, and nobody could touch it without their involvement. And so, I've definitely grown up in that a little bit here over the years. And now it's really kind of a breath of fresh air if you can get this information pushed out and get people kind of level set with their skills. Even if it's just hey, I'm having problems with this DAX formula, or can you take a look at this data model and see if it's a good one. And so how do we get there? I was trying to figure out how to say how we got there in just a couple words, and I think this sums it up. Lots of ideation and lots of patience. So similar to the, pushing the knowledge out and involving people, right? That involves getting ideas, because there's, I have a new person on my team right now, and I swear there's not a day that goes by that she doesn't say something that I didn't even think about, right? And I've been at this for, 8 years if you include the pre-Power BI years with Power Pivot, and she'll say something, and so, and this happens often, and sometimes, admittedly my knee-jerk reaction is to close the person off and, I know best. I've been at this for a long time, but then they'll throw that little nugget in there, and you're like, oh my gosh, that just completely reshaped my thinking on a certain issue. And then, of course, as I alluded to earlier, the patience with, making sure you have a good testing environment that you can go in, test, fail, test again. I think the example that I always walk around with is that Thomas Edison made like 9,995 light bulbs. And so you would think, well, that's a big failure, right? But he knew 9,995 ways not to make a light bulb. So that's kind of the way that I look at, my data modeling, DAX, Power BI, Power Platform kind of practice and knowledge. And so then, of course, like I mentioned with SSAS Tabular, we discovered Power BI at the enterprise level. And as everybody in this room probably knows, this is continuing to evolve, right? That Power BI is not, there becomes new opportunity with wrapping something in an app or adding flow to it, or all these other things that have taken off that are kind of beyond my own personal knowledge anymore. Another thing that I think was a big help on the SSAS Tabular side was there was probably, I think actually my first version of this model was 2014, so it's almost 6 years ago now. One day, rainy day, I sat down and I had access to our database, and I just started pulling data from our database, so facts and dimensions, and I just started drawing lines to see where all the intersections are, right? Because my company likes to sit around and talk about, oh, wouldn't it be great if we had this standardized, or wouldn't it be great if we had that standardized? And the interesting thing with this little, mad science-y type of thing was that there was more in common on that exercise between our facts and dimensions, financial, non-financial, than we thought there was. What I quickly realized was that it was also equally as hard, and still, 4 or 5 years later or so, I'm still trying to convince people that it's still much better shaped than what we think it is. But that tabular model really helped us kind of see exactly where, how could we create a dashboard that you filter on a project and you get not only financial information about it, you get kind of a balanced scorecard. What are your client SAT scores? What are your leading indicators? We have an internal business process thing about what might go wrong on the project. There was stuff about that, and it was really kind of a neat exercise. And then of course everybody says, wow, this is like close-up magic. How did you do that? How did you get to that type of thing? And so, what we're working on right now is a Power BI-based implementation for financial planning and analysis system. And one of the things that's going to grow out of that is, or that's also included in that scope, is an optimized, and this is my new favorite word. I wasn't throwing this word around a couple weeks ago, but is a optimized composite model. And so getting back to that SSAS tabular model that we did 4 years ago or so to figure out all the relationships, it's basically that in many ways, but it's more highly scoped on our business needs. I was like dragging and dropping and dumping data. It is also, that's really the thing. It's really more scoped on our business needs rather than just having a bunch of data in there than what we need. And what we're doing around this, that I'll talk about in a little bit with my, in a little bit, is that we're kind of seeing this as a new dawn. We're starting off on the right foot with documentation. We're starting off on the right foot with a governance process around releasing reports. Or developing and releasing reports. So we're pretty excited about that. Wow, are we already here? All right. So the biggest lessons learned from everything that we've done is that I could kind of impart on you. So the first one is to be able to recognize a good versus a bad data model as quickly as possible. Anybody want to take a stab at what a good data model versus a bad data model is? So if a good data model is, there's no shortage of Russo and Ferrari talking about this, and probably a bunch of others on the web, but you want to get to a good star schema data model. I mean, especially if you don't have advanced knowledge of data modeling, that's really what you want to strive for. I get a lot of things that come across my desk. Hey, can you take a look at my data model? And it's like all these lines, facts connecting facts and coming back up around this way, and all these relationships that I can't even follow, not to mention user unfriendly names for those tables. Like ISSR _ 103.2, blah, blah, blah. It's like, how do you navigate that data model at all? So recognizing a good star schema model, I think for folks, especially beginning, is really key. And then second is to really understand the DAX concepts of row and filter context. If you take a foundational course in Power BI, well, let me talk about my own experience. I don't want to speak for yours. When I took a foundational course in Power BI, these concepts were thrown at me, and we didn't really go really in detail to what they meant. We went right to the output, like, okay, we've got row and filter context, and now if you do this, you're playing with the filter context. And it didn't sink in for me the first couple times, and I don't know why. It's because these can be pretty big concepts. But you really want to understand as you're writing DAX, are you affecting the filter context? Are you affecting the row context? And what is being produced? Because otherwise, your DAX can get quite dangerous. It's one of those things where it's producing something, in the right thing 80% of the time, and then 20% of the time it's not, and you may not know about it because the person using it is not bringing it to your attention. Kind of a sub-point to the row filter context is to really understand the difference between aggregators and iterators in DAX. So aggregators are basically kind of what we're probably all used to if we've had some sort of Power BI training, the sum, the average, the max, the mins, and then iterators are the X functions, right? The sum X, and the aggregators are, let's just say for the purpose of this discussion, they're the ones affecting the filter context. Iterators are affecting the row context, and making sure you have those straight, especially if you have multiple segments of DAX logic that you're writing that maybe involve a little bit of everything. You just want to be crystal clear on it. I go back over this stuff all the time and something new sinks in. Reduce your reliance on related. So I don't know if you've, I almost feel like related is kind of a rite of passage in many ways because you get all set up in a foundations, a Power BI foundations course, and they show you how to do related and you're like, oh my gosh, I'd never have to do a VLOOKUP again. Never have to do it again. But then what happens is that can kind of quickly spiral out of control and you're doing related this and related that. And eventually I think, if I looked into my own crystal ball, we're probably going to be doing a lot more of this on an enterprise level very quickly in the next couple years. And you as leaders of Power BI in your organizations, you probably want to position yourself to be someone who can do it on the enterprise level rather than just in kind of your Power BI notebook. So that's another big piece of advice that I have. Learn to recognize pivoted versus unpivoted data sets. Again, I get models that come to me, and Matt, my model's just not quite working, like what the heck is going on? And then I open everything up and then I see account, organization, so these are columns, 2014, 2015, 2016, 2017, right? And now in Power Pivot, we can easily unpivot that data, right? So that you have a year column, right? So if you have, that's the best description of pivoted versus unpivoted data. So pivoted would be, in this example, your years are in the columns, and unpivoted would be you have a year column and your table gets much taller, right? So if you're trying to pull in, let's just say, a P&L into your data model and you're trying to, you want to model that, you want to, pull it into Power Query and use the unpivot function on those columns, it works beautifully. It's a very similar issue if you've done charts in Excel itself, right? Where you can't quite figure out why the chart isn't behaving. It's usually because you're trying to chart a P&L statement as opposed to a more unpivoted data format. Educate yourself a little bit on cardinality. This is another kind of big term. This is another forward-looking, all this stuff is gonna get more kind of enterprise heavy and out of our workbooks, crystal ball theory of mine. Because another way of saying this is, in some ways, is scope the data in your data models to what your business needs are. If you don't need a column, take it out. If you can filter, you only need all of the red balls, filter that, right? Filter it out before it even gets into your data model. If you've got something on the enterprise level and you've got access to somebody who can write a SQL view even better than the Power Query, because the Power Query is always recalculating, right? And so the more pressure you put on it, the quicker it's going to pop and make your solution untenable. So you just want to make sure, so just to back up real quick on cardinality. So cardinality is important with Microsoft, with Power BI because of the Vertipack compression engine. the way that the data is compressed in these in this engine is that, so for example, if you have a column that's just yes or no, okay, that is a low cardinality column because the vertipack compression engine takes that column, and even if you have 100 million yes no's, it compresses it into 2 values. If you have a data label on the side of your column that's labeling those columns from 1 to 100 million, you have a high cardinality table, right? Because it cannot, there's no compression that can be done on that. So this is one of the beauties of Power BI in general. But if you're pulling in that column that's taking up a lot of the storage engine on the vertipack compression engine, you're basically setting yourself up for your refresh to take a long time, your DAX to take a long time to recalculate, and perhaps even that box coming up that's, you just eventually have to go to Task Manager and shut the whole thing down anyway. This is my latest one. I would say try to steer clear of hacks. Most of the, if not all, actually I have no reason to not say all of the stuff that you see going on in Power BI, writing DAX, data modeling, these are not new concepts. You can go back to the 80s and 90s and find these BI concepts. But what's happening is now it's been pushed out to the people, right? And it's become really easy to kind of experiment around with it. So and I'm not saying everything out there is a hack per se, but if somebody is showing you how to, make this number turn into this number, just understand what's actually going on with that, right? Because you can end up with some code that's like this, and it works beautifully, but you may not, you just want to understand what that code is, because it may have some unintended consequences, believe me. And then, as I've said before, push as much ETL and SQL as possible. I think that's worth its weight in gold. All right, so those were some hard skills. Some soft skills. Test your candidates for the curiosity quotient. I just quick story. About late third quarter, early fourth quarter last year, executives were coming to me and they were saying, hey, can you push dashboards and reporting out faster than what you are? And I said, well, I can push it out faster, but it's not going to go through the proper process of being pushed out. I'm really trying to get this quality control process set up. And then they said, well, what do you need to push them out faster? And I'm always a pretty skeptical person about adding headcount because I know how this goes, right? You add headcount and then times get tough and then somebody comes to you and said, well, your position was the newest at the top of the list, so they're under the magnifying glass. I don't like defending that. I just don't. I have a team of 17 people, and I don't want to fire anybody. They're all great. And so anyway, I went back and I thought about it long and hard. And what dawned on me and what sunk in over the next couple weeks was that I really needed somebody who was really focused on the business analysis, the business requirements, managing the report development pipeline, managing how reports fit together with one another, managing how, kind of service level agreements around when we were getting reports out. So a revision takes 2 days and a new report takes 7 days, those types of things with the rest of the company. And what I ended up doing was hiring somebody with 0 Power BI experience. Well, she had a little bit. So this person I had worked with on on a project, kind of a special strategic planning project back in September. And as we got to the end of that project, there were the executives that were in charge of that project were starting to come up with all these ideas of reports and views and things that they wanted to see. And they all involved different data models. They all involved different, DACs to be written. And what I tried to do very quickly was come up with a format that I could get somebody to help me. And there really wasn't any other help except for this person who I eventually hired onto my team. And so I said, hey, look, this is kind of a long shot, but can you come and help me with these reports? And she was like, sure, what do you need me to do? And I said, okay, well, you need to take this and you pull it into Power Query and you add it to the data model and you do this and you do that, and this DAX gets written this way and these set of DAX get written that way. Do you got all that? Are you sure? Literally in like a 20, 30-minute conversation. And she said, she was just like, okay, well, yeah, that was quite a lot, but let me see what I can do. And she came back the next day and maybe a little bit, looking like she lacked sleep. But she had done it all, and she had also, what she said, the reason why she lacked a little sleep is because she actually dug into other stuff. She's like, okay, Matt told me how to do this, but this looks really related and really good. How do I do that? And then how do I do that? And how do I do that? And so when she came back in the morning, she knew how to do all this stuff I hadn't asked her to do. So anyway, fast forward 3 months, I offered her a job, and she's actually working out really fantastically, understanding everything from kind of the Power BI desktop side of things to the back end, SQL code, SSAS Tabular, like everything that's going on there. So, and the only way that I can understand that I can classify that success is that she has a curiosity quotient that's really, really high. Define what Power BI means. Potentially because I've been involved in this in what I would call Power BI for 8 years, right? Power BI came out in 2015, Power BI itself, but the whole Power Pivot mechanism and then the SharePoint BI stuff that I was explaining earlier. Within Power BI, I tend to include SQL, data modeling, DAX, SSAS Tabular, Azure AS, Power BI, Power BI Service, like all of these pieces that are part of Power BI. And one of the things that I'm grappling with now at my company is that people keep coming to me and saying, we need Power BI training. We need Power BI training, we need it now. And I have a course that I've taught internally and at Georgetown, but that is like, here's how you use Power Query, here's how you get data into your data model, here's how you model the data, here's how you write the DAX, right? A very typical kind of foundations course. But where we're at in our journey, that's all great, and I would never discourage anybody from that, but that's not what my company needs as a whole, in my opinion. So usually when you're talking to like IT, like our DBA, and we're saying Power BI, it means something completely different than when you're talking to an end user or someone on my team or someone on my financial planning analysis team versus somebody on my BI team. It just means so many different things. So I like to kind of break down that term when people say we need Power BI, because it almost just sounds to me like, hey, we need some stuff. Getting back to what I was talking about earlier with pushing the knowledge out, I don't think that there is any business or value anymore in hoarding data. Of course, not security concerns notwithstanding, right? You got to have good security around it, but you want to make sure that you are, in a way, an evangelist for your data, and if somebody needs access to it, you're the expert to get it to them or to help them write the report. That, I think, is where the value is going in the next couple couple years especially. I think it's already there, personally. Create a governance process. So I don't know how many of you were in Tommy's session earlier this morning, but he did a deep dive into this stuff. If you weren't in his session, I would recommend checking out his slides. So what we've done around governance, and governance is, I would say, is kind of in a pilot phase right now in my group, because now I have the help of this business analyst that I just added to the team. But what we're doing is we are creating we're kind of starting with what reports do we have out there, and how do they relate to each other? And then we're also dealing with new report requests. They're coming through ticketing system, or we're actually piloting the ticketing system right now. It's just our IT ticketing system that I said, hey, can we have a portal into that? They said, yeah, sure, for $600 a year. I'm like, yeah, give me $600 a year, no problem. And so basically they create a ticket. It prioritizes everybody's work in a way that we're doing based on service level agreements and severity levels and user dictated due dates and a couple different. As a matter of fact, we're locking down that prioritization right now. One reason, just as an aside to this, is that we have a data services team in India, and one of the biggest issues with that team has been, how do you communicate? How do you get the work, right? They're on basically turned upside down in terms of time, almost working on a completely opposite schedule as we are. They need clear instructions on what to do. So the ticketing system helps with that. We have a design document that's, what data model, what DAX, what visualization do you want on the page? We have a style manual that's dictating everything from, when I say dictate, it sounds like a bad word, but it's really, it's trying to give guidance on, how to tell a story, everything from how to tell a story of the dashboard to what fonts to use, where to put the logo, where to put the filter pane, right? Because if you can define these things and lock them down, you don't have to think about them anymore. And I don't know how much time I've thought about where to put the filter on a page. I'd like to have that time back. I really would. And then I separated this out from curate a governance process because it's very interrelated, but curate an information dissemination schema. So I was describing, kind of our reporting tree. So if you could imagine just like the way it sits right now is just a organizational hierarchical kind of view in Visio, where you've got the main report, and then how does that drill down? I'm also playing with this idea of horizontal versus vertical reporting. So horizontal reporting, and I'm just doing this to manage a team because otherwise people drive themselves crazy. Horizontal reporting would be akin to adding a tab, right? So I've got my main gross profit report, and now I want to see how much gross profit is coming from my Afghanistan versus non-Afghanistan. So that, to me, the way I'm defining it is a horizontal report. Now I want to see gross profit by contract type. Now I want to see gross profit by this, gross profit by that, right? So those slices would be kind of in the horizontal reporting schema. And then the vertical schema would be more the everything that supports getting to achieving those so drill down into like what is driving the gross profit. And so that's how we're talking about reporting now, because otherwise you get all of these kind of incongruent reports floating around all over the place that some are by like gross profit, and then gross profit by region, by sector. Then you have your invoicing, and you have it by region, by sector. Oh, wait, there is no sector, right? So we only have it by, there's no sector in invoicing, so we just have it by region. I don't like that. I don't know if I'm too type A about that type of stuff, but I feel like in a broader context, it doesn't really do that broader context much good. In addition to the curate, the information dissemination schema, or in addition to just how your reports are laid out, how are you displaying these reports? Are they coming through a Teams channel? Are they coming through a SharePoint site? Are they coming through Power BI itself, right? Because as you probably know, you create like a team site, for example, it automatically creates a workspace, which means you can publish a report. And, so it gets pretty messy really quick, especially with team sites. I don't know the type of governance at other organizations, but I could pull up and request a team site and have it stood up by the time the session's over, and then be publishing reports out there. And nobody's going to ask me any more questions than, what do you want it named? So I don't know how it is at other companies, but that is, those are the types of things I don't really have a good answer to yet, because it's so, for something that needs to be really structured, there's a lack of structure so far. And that's what I have. 15 minutes on the nose for questions. I wasn't sure I was going to get there. All right. Any questions about anything?